Hello, everyone. It's Professor Fernandez, and I am here to talk about plot, give you the skinny on plot, what that is. And really, when we talk about plot, we're actually talking about story structure. So I'm giving you the very basics on story structure so that you can analyze your story or any story, actually, anything with a narrative. Let's get started here. All right. So here's the skinny. By the end of um this particular lesson, you're going to know three different strike structure, a bunch of new words. You're going to understand how stories work and the actual honest to goodness definition of what plot is. So, talking about that, what do you think plot is? Define that for me. I'll give you a couple seconds. Time's up. So, you were probably told that plot is what happens in the story. That is wrong. That is not what plot is. And it took, for me, it took until I got into grad school and grad school set me straight. And I said, oh my God, we've all been taught plot incorrectly. And we have. Plot is not what happens in the story, or at least it's isn't just what happens in the story. Plot is actually the structure of the story. Plot is the foundation, it is the walls, it is the roof, it is the backbone of the story. While we have character um, and character motivation, which informs how the character moves through the entire story, and setting gives us the rule of the world, which informs us why the character is moving through the story and gives us kind of the boundaries of how they move through the story. There literally is no story without plot. Really, if we didn't have it, the characters would be in a big white void. So that's what plot is. Plot is structure, structure, structure. So here's the official definition. Plot is a literary device that writers use to structure what happens in a story. Plots must present an event, action, turning point that creates conflict. If you've ever heard someone says, if there is no conflict in the story, there is no story, that is completely correct. If there is no conflict, literally, it's just people in a void acting out, and that's it. The arc of a story's plot features a casual relationship between a beginning, a middle, and an end, in which the conflict is built to a climax and resolved in the conclusion. So if there is no beginning, middle, end, there's no plot. Interesting, interesting. So let's break down this criteria that we just learned in that last screen. There's a narrative arc. What narrative arc means is that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what it is. It's just you start somewhere, you go somewhere, you end somewhere. There's conflict. It's usually between the protagonist and antagonist. Let's go back to characters and what they want. Usually, whatever the protagonist wants, the antagonist is there in the way. The antagonist is does not mean an antagonist character does not mean that they are evil. It just means that they're in the way of what the protagonist wants. Then we see that the conflict builds up to a climax. All stories have a climax. Where they are is always up for debate. And then the turning points. Every story has turning points, which means the stakes are raised. That means the tension increases. Oh my God. And then it's that feeling of what's going to happen next. That's a turning point. And so, what I want to say about structure is that there's a bunch of different structures, bunch of them. I've only chosen three because those are what the three that the stories that I've chosen use. But there are a bunch. Um, the order is chosen by the writer on purpose. So the order of the structure is chosen for the writer. It's not always plug and play, but it's mostly plug and play. Sometimes the writer will switch some things around just because, they want to keep you on your toes. And a structure is very, very delicate, 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 delicate. you start messing with the structure, things start to come apart. I have seen many a writer cry when they're like, "Oh my God, my story's awful," and the first thing I do is read their story and say, "That's because your structure is off." If you've ever read or ever seen a movie where um it's not that great, like it starts off really good, but then it kind of like you're like, wah, wah, it's not that great. Um, it's because it has act two structure problems. Um, and the structure has been tinkered with, and so now it sucks. um, try it. Okay, so let's go through some vocabulary words here. Like I said before, the narrative arc is the beginning, the middle, and the end. That's the path that the story follows. Usually, when we're taught plot in high school or elementary school, that's what they're teaching us. What's the beginning? What's the middle of the end? They are teaching us narrative arc. They're not teaching us plot. Okay. Then we have the turning point that occurs at a moment when it becomes necessary to make a change. And so you'll see in one of the plot structures, there's two turning points between um, Act One and Act Two, and Act Two and Act Three. This is a climax that generally happens when the story exposes something. However, it's not the end of the narrative. It's the start of a rising action that falls after that, and the situation causing this turning point reaches its conclusion. So, turning points are important because they push the story forward. Turning points push the story forward. There's that pacing and that tension um, that we love to see, especially in movies, right? That is going somewhere, that we are being taken along for the ride. Then we have exposition, which is one of my favorite things. It's literally background. I just usually define it by background, but it actually gives us really good information, backstory or background for the characters, usually, but also other things that we need to understand what's going on in the action of the story. Exposition gives us context, and without context, we don't know why things are happening. Um, we don't know why they're happening and why we should care why they're happening. Anagonosis, I always say this wrong, but this is a moment of insight of a story's plot in which a character, usually the protagonist, shifts from ignorance to awareness. This is where they get the information that they need and they're like, oh, I've been wrong this entire time. That person isn't the villain, it's this person. If you're into Marvel at all, this is the moment where we find out that somebody is a Skrull, and they have been plotting to take over the world for a while. Or this is where we find out that the Winter Soldier killed Tony's parents. And so we go from ignorance to awareness, and that action actually also pushes it forward, because then pushes the story forward, pushes the narrative forward, because then us as consumers of the story say, all right, now that you know the truth, what are you going to do about it? So then hilarity usually ensues. All right, let's get to the structures here. Let's talk about Aristotle's Poetics. It's the most common one, and you've probably seen this before. It begins here with exposition. You get a lot of background here. It sets up the world, it sets up what's going on, and then you have the conflict and rising action. So you get the exposition, then something happens, and the action starts, and so we're off to the races. And we keep going, and just like a train up a hill, we keep going up into the climax, and then the falling action. Oh my God, things are happening. And the falling action here happens really quickly. It happens quicker than the rising action. So the falling action could be literally like a sentence in a short story. It could be really, really quick. And then there's a resolution. So, and that resolution can also come quick. So this is the most common. The 3-act structure, usually you want to use this for, or this is usually used for movies, TV shows. So you have 3 acts. So this happens in 3 sections. The biggest section is Act 2. This is where most movies, if they are horrible movies, this is where usually where they have the issues, the structure issues, is called the saggy middle. And so we have the inciting incident here. We set up the ordinary world, and then something happens, boom, and then we're off to the races. And this sets up the entire structure or the entire story. This is like, I think, the first 20-30 minutes of a movie here, right? Everything's great until it's not, and then something pushes us forward. We're off on an adventure. We're into the Sokovia Accords, whatever that is. Plot point one pushes us into act two, and there's a confrontation. This is where, your superheroes are fighting. This is where people are trying to find the truth, and they're confronted by it. There's a midpoint here, and that's usually about the middle part of the movie. You can tell because that's when usually people are going to the bathroom in a movie theater. You can feel it when you're like, oh, I'm halfway through. It feels like a halfway point. We know enough to know that we know a lot, but we also know enough that we need to know more, right? And then something happens to propel us into act three, where we have a resolution. This is the climax here. This is Iron Man and Captain America and the Winter Soldier just going at it. And no, we're not signing these accords, and we're going into hiding, and Tony, you're awful, and whatever. And so that's where we are. And then we have a resolution here. And then we have A, B, D, C, E. And I want you to note that it's not A, B, C, D, E. The D and the C are switched around. And this is what it means. It's action, background, development, climax, and ending. It is in that order. So when you're looking at that structure, if it doesn't start with action, then it's not A, B, D, C, E. Action doesn't have to be big. It can be a small action. It could be a tear. It could be a sigh. It could be it could be laughter. It doesn't have to be a big, huge explosion or a car chase, right? It could be something tiny. It could be people walking down the street. But as long as there's action there, then it's starting with action. Then you have background, which is your exposition, the development, which is the whole rising action situation, your saggy middle, your act two situation, the climax, and then the resolution or the ending. So let's talk about endings to stories, which is just as important as the beginnings of stories. There's a couple of endings here. Let's talk about them. There's, of course, the happy ending. Central character makes a sacrifice and people get what they want. It's a positive, lighthearted ending to the story. And so then Cinderella and the prince marry off. We get this wonderful swell of a beautiful love song at the end, and people are crying, and it's wonderful, right? Your typical happy ending. Then you have unhappy endings where the actual character or the principal character here acts logically, and does things right, but fails anyway. And the story might end with a conflict resolution, true, but people are losing things, or they're making sacrifices. It is not a satisfying ending, but it is an ending. Not all endings will be satisfying. Some endings will not end in catharsis at all. And so this exists. Don't confuse unhappy endings with a tragic ending, which questions by the end about the sadness and its reason for the central character does not make a choice for sacrifice or otherwise. So, unhappy ending could be the ending of Winter Soldier. Of course, I'm a big Marvel person, so I'm going to go with Marvel, and they're really easy to think about. Tragic ending would be the ending of Captain America, the first Captain America. Tragic because he doesn't go dancing with Peggy Carter, and like he missed his whole life, a whole sacrifice. It's just, what the heck is that, right? So those are the difference. Don't confuse unhappy ending with a tragic ending. Something like the Raymond Carver piece, Popular Mechanic, is a tragic ending. There's a sacrifice there. But something like Harrison Bergeron is more of an unhappy ending, right? There's a sacrifice, but there is a conflict resolution. Somebody lost something, right? Here are some things to remember. The choice of ending, the choice of beginning, the choice of exposition, those are all choices. Why did the writer start the story that way? Why is the conflict the conflict? Always question the ending. Why would you end a story that way? Why is it happy, unhappy, or tragic? How do you know? If I read it again, will the ending hit me differently as a reader? And always remember that plot equals structure. Take time to figure out what that structure is and why it's being used, and that will lead you to the wonderful argument there. So let's wrap this up here. Let's wrap up this long lesson. I want you to take 2 minutes to think about and discuss with yourself, or maybe with classmates if you want to do it in a discussion board or through text, what you learned about plot right now. And how is plot important? And how will it help you analyze a story? All right. I hope that was helpful here. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.